Well, happy Friday. Hope you have enjoyed your reading through the Word this week. I pray for everyone who watches this, everyone who supports this ministry and who participates in it, partakes of it, that God is using this to encourage you in the Word. That's really my passion, is to get you in the Bible yourself, reading it directly, reading it, the full counsel of God's Word, that you're edified, really built up. Again, you cannot read God's Word without being affected by it. That is just the nature of His Word. Isaiah 55:11 says that His Word does not go out void, but accomplishes what He sends it for. So no one, believer or unbeliever, can have an encounter with God's Word and remain unchanged. So that's really my desire, is to build you up in the Word and to educate you, to help you see maybe connections or explain it a little differently than you've seen it explained before, so that when you read through it, it makes more sense. So what we're looking at today in chapter 15 is, you could see right at the start here, verse 1, we who are strong have an obligation. So we're looking at what are the obligations that the mature have. I trust that most of us that are watching this are watching it because either we are mature and we want to grow in our maturity, or we're maybe relatively new believers and we have a desire to grow in maturity, grow in knowledge, grow in understanding. So we're all on this path to maturity here. So what are the obligations that the mature have? Let me first say this. Who are the mature? Well, the mature is the person who knows a little bit more or lives a little bit more holier than the person behind them or in front of them or on either side of them at church. They are the people who are just a little bit ahead in the faith in a number of different ways, and we have obligations to those who are just coming into the faith behind us. Let me encourage you. I come across believers who have been in the faith for a long time, in church, listening to sermons, perhaps even attending Sunday school, but they are far from mature. Talk about that as we go through our reading. If that's you, I don't want to shame you, but I do want to challenge you that if you've been in the church for a long time, you need to cultivate maturity in your understanding and maturity in your living. And let me challenge you to do that by going through verses 1 through 7 of chapter 15, where it talks about those responsibilities and obligations that the mature have. Let me just run through them. Verse 1 is patience. I think it's talking about being patient with those who are less mature. Verse 2, building them up. Verse 3, being Christ-like toward others. Verse 4, wisely teaching God's full word to others. And verses 5 through 7, praying for the church you're in or the fellowship that you're involved in to be an encouraging and praising and welcoming group of believers. That's your responsibility as the mature. Give you maybe a sad story that I read about somebody I admire greatly, Louis Sperry Chafer, founder of Dallas Theological Seminary, writer of systematic theology from a dispensational perspective. Story I recall about Louis Sperry Chafer: he was teaching in a church as a guest at a Sunday school, and someone asked him a question, and Louis Sperry Chafer tried to answer it clearly, and the person answering the question wasn't getting it, so they asked it again. Louis Sperry Chafer again responded maybe a little less patiently, a little bit more directly, and the poor person that was asking the question still wasn't getting it. They responded to the answer with more questions, just betraying their misunderstanding, or perhaps more likely they had a different view, and you know how people with different views sometimes use questions to state their view. Finally, Louis Sperry Chafer responded to him by saying, "Sir, I can give you answers, but I can't give you brains." Well, that seemed to me like a harsh answer a little bit. Doesn't display maybe some of the qualities that we would want to see in ourselves or want people to treat us with. So verses 1 through 7 of chapter 15 talk about those obligations and responsibilities. Verses 8 through 13 then shift from obligations and responsibilities that the mature have to what they're promoting, and really unity. It follows on from verses 5 through 7 and flows into unity and Christ being our model for service in the church. Remember, we're closing out a section here since chapter 12, verse 1, that is talking about service. And he brings it right back to Jesus, that he is our servant in the church, and a servant that promotes unity and draws all men to himself. And as he's going to explain in Ephesians, the book of Ephesians 2, verses 11 through 22, creates one man out of both Jews and Gentiles, one new man, the church. Christ is that model servant. And very interesting here, at the end of verse 8 and the beginning of verse 9, don't miss this, two different approaches, because two different relationships here. For the Jews, Jesus served to confirm the promises that were made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So we look at the covenants, the biblical covenants, the Abrahamic covenant, the land covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. Jesus confirms all those. He doesn't override those. He doesn't abrogate those. We saw in verses 9 to 11 that chapters 9 to 11, that God isn't done with Israel. So Jesus confirms those Israel to the Jews, those covenants that had been given to them. But I'm not a Jew. I'm a Gentile. He doesn't confirm the covenants that he's made with Israel to me. What does he do? To the Gentiles, Christ displays God's mercy. So God made himself obligated to the Jews long, long ago. He made a commitment voluntarily, freely, unilaterally, and he is not going back on that commitment to the Jews. To the Gentiles, he's extended mercy. Both of these are acts of grace on God's part. So these come together in Jesus. And in verses 10 to 13, Paul talks about the Gentiles then being glorified, or glorifying the God of Israel. That's where we find this unity. Chapter 15, verses 14 through the end of the chapter basically is an appeal or a commendation. Verse 14, this is a good church, a church that's even getting better and better. Paul commends them for being a good church. And then in verses 15 through 19, he is explaining how he is faithfully discharging the ministry he has for the benefit of the church in Rome. That's what this letter is. That's what his anticipated visit is going to be about, discharging that ministry. Verses 20 through 24, then Paul moves on to talk about his plans, what's coming, and their part in his plans, a financial aspect and a spiritual aspect. Financially, in verses 25 through 29, Paul makes kind of lays out a principle for New Testament giving. You know, in the Old Testament, we had these tithes, and there were multiple tithes. There was a tithe annually to support the ministry of the temple and the priests. There was a tithe annually to support the poor. I think it was annually. It might have been every few years. And then there was another tithe to set aside to go up to Jerusalem for the 3 annual Jerusalem feasts. So there are basically 3 tithes through the years, Jews giving approximately 30% of their income to the upkeep of the temple and temple worship. Of course, the temple's gone. We are not obligated to that. So what is our principle for giving that guides our giving in the New Testament time. We see that in verse 27. Let me back up to verse 26. It says, "For Macedonia and Achaia have been pleased to make some contribution for the poor among the saints in Jerusalem." So these predominantly Gentile churches in Greece and northern Greece and central Greece were giving money to support the church in Jerusalem. Well, why would they do that? And he tells them here, for they were pleased to do it, and indeed they, the Greek churches, owe it to them, the Jerusalem church. So they ought to be, for if the Gentiles have come to share in their spiritual blessings, they ought to also be of service to them in material blessings. So ought to means there's an obligation there, and the obligation is to give materially to those who benefit you spiritually. So ideally, that's your local church. You know, your local church is the one that if they are benefiting you spiritually, then you should give materially to your local church. If there's other ministries, this one or others that maybe you participate in online or you listen to podcasts, and they are benefiting you spiritually, or I'm benefiting you spiritually, then you should give financially to those. That is the principle to be followed here. If you want to give to this ministry, I'm a 501c3. You go to and there'll be a link below, but if you go to my website, theofaith.org, there's a Partner With Me tab, and you can go there and you can give online, or if you want to send me a check, contact me at drdan@theofaith.org, and I'll give you my address where you can send that. And again, it's totally up to you. I'm not trying to pressure you or anything, as much as give you the opportunity, because it's God's will, and I think this is the New Testament principle for giving, that you give materially where you are benefited spiritually. And then Paul not only asks for, as you read through this, financial support for the ministry he's carrying out, but also prayer support in verses 30 to 33. That brings us to the end of chapter 15. I'm finishing up a little early because I told you yesterday I would. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. If you're mature, the way to apply this is to read those verses 1 through 7 and display those qualities of maturity. Look for someone to help and build up and encourage and edify. Work for unity in your church. Work for unity among the brothers and sisters there. And then, be those people. Be the people that are supporting materially those who are benefiting you spiritually, causing you to grow. And be praying for me. Be praying for other ministries. Be praying for your church. I'm sure your pastor would love to know that you're praying for him. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. Have a great weekend in the Lord, and I'll talk to you again on Monday as we finish up the book of Romans.